By the time the base at Nui Jat began shutting down in late 1971, the numbers on paper looked deceptively small. Around 580 men had served in the Australian Special Air Service Regiment squadrons in Vietnam. In 6 years, they had mounted nearly 1,200 patrols deep in Viet Cong-controlled jungle, recording 492 confirmed enemy killed, 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. Their own losses were 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidental deaths, 1 missing, 1 dead from illness, and 28 wounded. On most maps of the war, these men are a thin annotation. In Viet Cong recollections and later Australian histories, they carry a different label: Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle, an enemy seldom seen until it was too late. This documentary asks a simple, factual question. How did a few hundred patrolling specialists become a presence so feared that the enemy remembered them not by unit number, but as ghosts? Cabinet papers covered the minister's desk in Canberra on the 29th of April, 1965. The documents recorded Australia's decision to commit an infantry battalion and support units to South Vietnam. Defense briefings outlined the deployment: 1 battalion to join American forces at Bien Hoa, northeast of Saigon. The decision reflected Australia's alliance commitments. The papers also revealed something else. Australian military doctrine already diverged from American practice. While U.S. forces favored large-scale search and destroy operations, Australian training emphasized smaller patrols, reconnaissance, and separation of guerrillas from civilian populations. The 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, deployed to Bien Hoa in June 1965, operating under the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade. After-action reports from those first months showed the contrast clearly. American operations swept through areas with company and battalion-sized forces. Australian patrols moved more slowly, with smaller units staying out longer. The experience shaped planning for what would come next. By early 1966, defense staff were designing something different, an independent Australian task force that would fight the war its own way. Brigadier David Jackson received orders to form the 1st Australian Task Force. General Sir John Wilton, Chief of the General Staff, approved the concept. The task force would establish a permanent base in Phước Tuy Province, southeast of Saigon. From that base, constant patrolling would deny the Viet Cong their jungle sanctuaries. The Department of Veterans Affairs later summarized the concept. The idea behind Australian operations in Phước Tuy was to drive the Viet Cong from their jungle sanctuaries and camps and remove them from areas where they could exert influence over the local people. This patrol-centric approach created immediate structural requirements. The task force would need infantry battalions for holding ground and conducting sweeps. It would need artillery, armored personnel carriers, engineers, and aviation. It would also need something else: a specialist reconnaissance force capable of operating deep in enemy-controlled territory for extended periods. The decision to fight a different kind of war meant the task force required different tools. Within 12 months, a brigade-sized Australian force would stand at a base called Nui Jat. That base would need eyes and ears reaching far beyond its wire perimeter. Aerial reconnaissance photographs landed on planning desks in early June 1966. The images showed a rubber plantation 8 kilometers north of Baria, the provincial capital of Phước Tuy. Survey teams confirmed the site's suitability. On the 5th of June 1966, engineers began clearing the area that would become Nui Jat. The site selection was deliberate. Phước Tuy Province sat astride critical routes connecting Saigon to the port of Vung Tau. Intelligence reports described the province as swarming with Viet Cong guerrillas. Establishing a permanent base there would challenge enemy control. Work began immediately. Engineers cleared vegetation and displaced local residents from a 4,000 to 5,000 meter exclusion zone designated Line Alpha. Inside this perimeter, the 1st Australian Task Force would build a fortified base capable of supporting sustained operations. The task force composition reflected its mission. 2 infantry battalions arrived first: 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. Artillery batteries set up firing positions. Armoured personnel carriers from the 1st Armoured Personnel Carrier Squadron provided mobile firepower. Engineers, signals units, and support elements followed. Luscombe Airfield was constructed within the base. Artillery fire bases ringed the perimeter. Signal links connected Nui Jat to Vung Tau, where the 1st Australian Logistics Support Group maintained supply lines by road and helicopter. The base design revealed Australian intentions. This was not a defensive position, meant merely to survive. Nui Jat was designed as a launch platform for aggressive patrolling. No. 9 Squadron, RIAF, provided Iroquois helicopters for troop insertions deep into the jungle. Artillery could reach targets throughout the province. The Viet Cong recognized the threat. Within weeks of the base's establishment, enemy forces attempted to demonstrate it could not stand. On the 18th of August, 1966, elements of the 275th Viet Cong Regiment attacked D Company, 6th RAR, during a patrol near Long Tan. The battle lasted several hours in driving rain. Australian infantry, supported by artillery from Nui Jat and armoured personnel carriers, held their position. The Battle of Long Tan killed 18 Australians and an estimated 245 Viet Cong. More importantly, it proved the base would not be overrun or abandoned. With Nui Jat secure, planning shifted from survival to sustained offensive operations. The free fire zone and strong logistics base made it possible to deploy small reconnaissance teams for long periods in enemy territory. Within weeks, one such team would arrive at Vung Tau. Movement orders dated the 16th of June, 1966 directed 3rd Squadron, Special Air Service Regiment to deploy from Australia to South Vietnam. The squadron disembarked at Vung Tau and moved overland to Nui Jat, joining the 1st Australian Task Force as its reconnaissance element. The squadron arrived with a specific mission. Task Force planners needed intelligence on Viet Cong movements, base locations, and supply routes beyond the range of conventional patrols. They needed this intelligence continuously and from deep inside enemy-controlled territory. The SAS brought a capability designed for exactly this role. 4 to 6 man patrols would insert by helicopter into remote jungle areas, operate independently for days, and report enemy activity via radio. When necessary, these small teams could conduct ambushes or call artillery and airstrikes onto targets they identified. Equipment reflected the patrol mission. Each soldier carried an L101 self-loading rifle, or M16, with one M60 or L4 light machine gun per patrol. PRC-25 radios provided communication with Nui Jat and helicopter support. Claymore mines allowed small teams to ambush larger enemy forces. Weight restrictions meant minimal rations and no resupply. Patrols carried everything they needed for their assigned duration. Cooperation with No. 9 Squadron AF proved essential. Iroquois helicopters inserted patrols into landing zones, sometimes under enemy observation. The same helicopters extracted teams when their mission ended or when contact required immediate withdrawal. Pilots learned to work with SAS ground controllers, coordinating artillery and air support during contacts. Early patrol reports validated the concept. 4-man teams successfully observed company and battalion-sized Viet Cong units without detection. Radio reports provided real-time intelligence that shaped task force operations. When patrols made contact, the combination of surprise, disciplined fire, and rapid extraction limited SAS casualties while inflicting losses on numerically superior enemy forces. The squadron's operational tempo quickly established patterns that would continue throughout the Australian presence. Historian David Horner later described SAS operations as conducted deep behind enemy lines, conducting surveillance at close range, poised to spring into violent action at need. By the end of 1966, patrol logs documented dozens of successful missions. The baseline numbers appeared modest. One squadron, rotating patrols, a handful of contacts each month. Over 6 years, the cumulative total would reach nearly 1,200 patrols, a scale of sustained deep reconnaissance invisible on most campaign maps, but central to how Australia fought in Phước Tuy Province. Selection for the Special Air Service Regiment began at Campbell Barracks, Swanbourne, Western Australia. Training timetables and course reports from January 1967 documented the process that produced SAS patrol members. The selection course tested physical endurance, navigation, and decision-making under stress. Candidates began with long-range navigation exercises across unfamiliar terrain. Maps, compass, and pace counting were the only tools permitted. The distances increased daily. Sleep deprivation became a constant factor. Instructors evaluated not just completion, but decision quality when exhausted. The selection march came near the end. Candidates carried full equipment over distances exceeding 60 kilometers. Medical staff monitored for heat casualties. Most candidates did not finish. Those who did faced additional screening. The regiment's purpose shaped every aspect of training beyond selection. Small teams operating independently for days needed more than fitness. They required advanced skills in camouflage, observation, demolitions, first aid, and communications. Each patrol member trained to perform multiple specialist roles. Training emphasized operating without detection. Patrols learned to move slowly through jungle, minimizing noise and visual signature. Observation posts were sited for maximum concealment. Radio procedures were practiced until they became automatic, even under stress. The objective was clear: complete the mission without the enemy knowing you were there. Equipment selection reflected the same priorities. The L101 self-loading rifle provided reliable firepower with 7.62mm ammunition. Teams that preferred lighter weight and higher magazine capacity chose the M16. The M60 light machine gun gave small patrols substantial firepower. Claymore mines allowed a 4-man team to ambush a larger enemy force and break contact immediately. Weight calculations were constant. More ammunition meant fewer rations or less water. Heavier radios provided better range but reduced mobility. Every item carried had to justify its weight over a 5 to 7 day patrol. Medical training went beyond basic first aid. Patrol medics learned to treat gunshot wounds, fractures, and tropical diseases in the field without evacuation. Helicopter extraction might take hours if enemy forces controlled the area. Historian David Horner later described the regiment as a highly disciplined force operating secretly at the cutting edge of Australia's defence. The description reflected documented training outcomes. Patrol reports and interviews showed soldiers capable of independent operations with minimal supervision. Over 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam between 1962 and 1973. Approximately 580 passed through SAS Vietnam squadrons. The selection ratio explained why patrol reports occupied disproportionate space in task force operational files, despite the small number of personnel involved. An operational order dated August 1967 outlined the first Australian task force concept for Phước Tuy Province. The document, filed with Department of Veterans Affairs summaries, detailed the patrol-centric approach that would define Australian operations. The objective was specific: drive Viet Cong forces from jungle sanctuaries and prevent them from influencing the civilian population. The method was continuous patrolling. Infantry battalions would conduct deliberate sweeps through assigned areas. Artillery and armored personnel carriers would provide mobile fire support. SAS patrols would operate deeper, identifying enemy routes and base areas. The concept represented a departure from South Vietnamese practice. Department of Veterans Affairs documentation later noted, Australian tactics surprised the Viet Cong, who were used to meeting a South Vietnamese enemy that fought from defensive positions and rarely pursued them into the jungle. Australian patrols operated day and night. Multi-day operations became standard. Infantry companies established patrol bases in the jungle, sending out smaller patrols to cover assigned areas systematically. When enemy forces were located, artillery and airstrikes could be called within minutes. The SAS role within this system was specific. 4 to 6 man patrols inserted beyond the range of infantry operations, sometimes near the provincial border or in neighboring provinces. These teams observed enemy movement along infiltration routes and reported locations of camps and supply dumps. Patrol reports fed directly into task force planning. When SAS teams identified significant enemy concentrations, infantry operations followed. Examples included operations like Hat Dish, where SAS reconnaissance preceded large-scale sweeps that uncovered major logistics facilities. The operational tempo strained all task force elements. Infantry battalions rotated companies through patrol duties continuously. Artillery batteries maintained 24-hour readiness. Helicopter crews flew multiple missions daily. SAS squadrons maintained 3 to 5 patrols in the field simultaneously. Radio logs documented the system functioning. SAS patrols reported enemy movement. Artillery batteries calculated firing data. Infantry companies prepared to exploit. The coordination required extensive training and reliable communications. The effect on enemy forces became visible in captured documents and interrogation reports. Viet Cong units operating in Phuoc Tuy faced constant pressure. Areas previously used for rest and resupply became dangerous. Movement during daylight risked detection. Task Force operational summaries recorded the cumulative effect. By late 1967, hundreds of patrols had covered Phuoc Tuy systematically. SAS patrols represented a small percentage of total patrols, but operated in the most remote and dangerous areas. The presence of these teams forced enemy units to account for possible observation anywhere in the province. A contact report dated the 18th of July, 1966 recorded a brief engagement east of Nui Jat. An SAS patrol had established an ambush position along a jungle track identified as an enemy route. Australian War Memorial photographs from similar contacts show the ANPRC-25 radio that connected patrols to fire support. SAS ambush doctrine differed from conventional practice. Where larger units might develop an engagement to fix and destroy enemy forces, SAS teams planned short, violent contacts followed by immediate withdrawal. The objective was to inflict casualties, gather intelligence, and deny the enemy time to react. The technical execution was precise. Patrols selected ambush sites based on terrain that provided concealment and covered withdrawal routes. M1801 claymore mines were positioned to cover the kill zone, aimed at chest height. Each mine contained 700 steel balls, backed by 680 grams of C4 explosive. The curved shape directed the blast in a 60-degree arc. The patrol positioned its M60 or L4 light machine gun to cover the kill zone. Riflemen positioned to provide flanking fire. Radio operator remained ready to call artillery if the contact escalated. All positions were sighted with withdrawal routes identified. When enemy forces entered the kill zone, the patrol commander initiated the ambush electrically. Claymores detonated simultaneously. Machine gun and rifle fire followed immediately. The engagement lasted seconds. The patrol withdrew to a pre-arranged rendezvous point before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Artillery support was planned before the patrol inserted. Fire missions were pre-registered on likely enemy approach routes and the ambush site itself. If the patrol needed to break contact, artillery could fire within 2 minutes of the radio call. The casualty data reflected the doctrine's effectiveness. The overall SAS figure of 492 confirmed enemy killed and 106 possibly killed came from hundreds of such contacts over 6 years. SAS losses remained remarkably low. 1 killed in action during the entire period, 1 died of wounds, 28 wounded. Publisher descriptions of SAS operations emphasized operating deep behind enemy lines, poised to spring into violent action at need. The phrase captured the patrol method. Days of silent observation punctuated by brief, precisely controlled violence. Later analyses credited SAS patrols with kill ratios higher than any conventional element in the task force. The statistics reflected training and doctrine, not random aggression. The defining feature of SAS operations was how rarely patrols had to fire at all. Most missions involved observation and reporting. When combat occurred, it was brief, planned, and immediately followed by withdrawal. Intelligence officers at 1st Australian Task Force headquarters sorted through captured documents throughout 1968. Interrogation reports from prisoners supplemented the written material. Together, these sources revealed how Viet Cong units perceived Australian operations. The captured documents showed patterns. Enemy orders emphasized tightening security around camps. Movement instructions required smaller groups and multiple route options. Rest periods were shortened. Logistics caches were moved frequently and dispersed. The reasons appeared in tactical assessments. Viet Cong reports described Australian forces as persistent in patrolling jungle areas day and night. Unlike South Vietnamese units, which typically operated from fixed positions near roads and villages, Australians pursued into remote areas and maintained presence there. Intelligence summaries identified references to elite foreign units capable of sudden attacks on previously secure locations. The documents did not always specify unit designations, but the operational descriptions matched SAS patrol tactics. Small teams, unexpected appearance, rapid withdrawal. Department of Veterans Affairs analyses and later Army historical studies cited these documents as evidence that Australian tactics altered enemy behavior. David Horner's research into SAS operations incorporated captured material showing Viet Cong concern about reconnaissance elements operating in areas previously considered safe rear zones. The enemy response was rational. If patrols might appear anywhere at any time, then every location required security measures. Movement became slower and more cautious. Larger gatherings attracted greater risk. Supply operations required more guards and time. The cumulative effect shaped the tactical environment throughout Phuoc Tuy. Viet Cong forces operating in the province faced different constraints than those in adjacent areas. Planning had to account for likely Australian detection. Operations required contingencies for sudden contact in supposedly secure areas. The psychological dimension appeared in post-war Vietnamese recollections and Australian analyses. The specific label Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle, would emerge clearly in later sources, but the foundation for that perception appeared in these wartime documents. Enemy forces described an opponent seldom seen until too late. The intelligence value exceeded the tactical information in any single document. Patterns across multiple documents revealed strategic effects. Australian patrols were not just gathering information, they were changing how enemy units operated throughout the province. For task force planners, the captured documents validated the operational concept. Continuous patrolling created uncertainty that restricted enemy freedom of action. The effect was measurable not just in body counts, but in enemy behavior. Forces that moved cautiously, dispersed frequently, and shortened rest periods operated less effectively than those with secure rear areas. David Horner's book, SAS, Phantoms of the Jungle, appeared in 1989, drawing on patrol reports and veteran interviews. Operational maps and regimental histories were laid alongside the text, connecting documented operations to the title that would define SAS Vietnam service. The book's title reflected more than literary choice. Publisher descriptions stated explicitly, it was with good reason the Viet Cong came to call them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. The Vietnamese phrase Ma Rung translates directly as phantoms or ghosts of the jungle. Later, official and semi-official sources repeated the term, establishing it as authentic enemy terminology rather than Australian invention. The nickname appeared in Department of Veterans Affairs materials, monument inscriptions, and regimental commemorations. From the SAS perspective, the designation seemed incongruous. Training documents and patrol reports describe technical specialists conducting reconnaissance missions. Soldiers saw themselves as professionals executing specific tasks with specific tools: observation, reporting, occasional ambush, extraction. The enemy perception differed fundamentally. Viet Cong forces operating in Phuoc Tuy and adjacent provinces encountered an opponent that violated their assumptions about how government forces operated. Patrols appeared in areas thought secure. Attacks came without warning. By the time reaction forces arrived, the Australians had vanished. The operational method created the ghostly image. Patrols moved slowly, minimizing noise and visual signature. Observation posts were positioned for concealment rather than comfort. Radio communications avoided enemy direction finding. Helicopter insertions and extractions often occurred at night or in bad weather when enemy observation was degraded. The technology enhanced the effect. PRC-25 radios allowed patrols to call artillery fire from positions kilometers away from gun positions. The enemy might see the explosions but not the observers. Helicopter extraction meant patrols could disappear from an area within minutes, leaving no trail to follow. The kill ratio reinforced the perception. A 4-man patrol might ambush a squad or platoon, inflict several casualties, and withdraw before superior numbers could respond. The claymore mines and coordinated fire created brief, intense violence disproportionate to patrol size. The nickname compressed hundreds of individual operations into a single concept. It represented enemy acknowledgement that Australian reconnaissance patrols had achieved a psychological effect beyond their numerical strength. Viet Cong units operating in SAS patrol areas had to assume possible observation at any time and any place. The paradox was complete. The regiment's most famous identity in Vietnam derived not from what it showed, but from what it did not. No large formations, no visible build-up, only sudden strikes and absence. Operational summaries from the 1st of July 1969 documented expanded SAS patrol areas. Teams now deployed beyond Phuoc Tuy into Long Can, Bien Hoa, and Binh Tuy provinces. The mission remained reconnaissance and interdiction, but the geographic scope increased significantly. The expansion reflected task force assessments of enemy activity. Major Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam base areas existed in the Mai Thao Mountains and Ha Dik Zone, both beyond Phuoc Tuy's borders, but critical to enemy operations in the province. SAS patrols provided intelligence on these sanctuaries. The extended operations put patrols farther from Nui Jat and support assets. Helicopter flight times increased. Artillery support became more complex, requiring coordination with multiple fire bases. Radio communications worked at longer ranges but with less reliability. Patrol reports documented significant finds. Teams identified major logistics dumps, hospitals, and training areas in the Mai Thao Mountains. These reports enabled large operations like Operation Marsden in December 1969, which uncovered extensive enemy infrastructure. The New Zealand SAS troop, operating under Australian command from 1968, contributed significantly to patrol numbers. By 1971, the New Zealand element had conducted 169 patrols. Combined with Australian squadrons rotating through 3-month tours, the cumulative total approached 1,200 patrols over 6 years. The casualty figures updated continuously, but remained remarkably low relative to operations conducted. Monument Australia summaries quantified the results. SAS patrols inflicted heavy casualties on the Viet Cong while sustaining 6 deaths and 28 wounded across the entire deployment. The expanded patrol zone forced enemy units to account for possible SAS presence across multiple provinces in Viet Cong. Base areas previously considered secure rear zones required increased security. Movement routes needed more screening. Rest and refit cycles faced greater disruption. Task Force operational summaries used specific language. Australian forces dominated their area of operations. For SAS, domination meant something different than for infantry battalions. It meant the enemy could not assume safety anywhere within hundreds of square kilometers. The cumulative effect built throughout 1969 and 1970. While overall Australian force levels remained relatively constant at approximately 8,000 personnel, the reach of reconnaissance operations expanded. 4-man patrols ranged across terrain where battalion-sized operations could not sustain themselves logistically. By 1970, captured documents and interrogation reports showed enemy units modifying behavior across the entire region. The psychological weight of possible observation exceeded the actual number of patrols in the field at any given time. Uncertainty itself became an operational factor. Staff officers at Allied headquarters in Saigon compiled comparative casualty and strength tables throughout the war. The statistics for 1970 provided context for understanding different force contributions and operational methods. American involvement in Vietnam reached its peak in 1968 to 1969. Approximately 2.7 million Americans served in theater during the war. Total American casualties reached 58,000, 220 killed, and over 300,000 wounded. The casualty rate stood at approximately 1 in 10 personnel. Australian force levels peaked at approximately 8,000 personnel deployed to South Vietnam. Total Australian casualties from 1962 to 1973 numbered 523 killed and approximately 2,400 wounded. The percentage of casualties to total personnel deployed was lower than American rates, but still reflected sustained combat operations. The SAS Vietnam figures presented a sharp statistical contrast. Approximately 580 men served in SAS squadrons deployed to Vietnam over 6 years. Total SAS deaths numbered 6. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidental deaths, 1 missing, 1 died from illness. Wounded totaled 28. The casualty ratio approached 1 in 20, less than half the overall Australian rate and far below the American rate. This occurred despite SAS patrols operating consistently in enemy-dominated terrain beyond the range of friendly forces. The enemy casualty figures show the inverse relationship. The 1st Australian Task Force recorded 3,370 Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam killed during its operations. The SAS share of this total was 492 confirmed killed and 106 possibly killed. A unit representing less than 1% of task force strength accounted for approximately 15% of enemy casualties. The comparison extended to patrol operations. Task force units conducted thousands of patrols during the Australian presence. SAS squadrons, with 3 to 5 patrols deployed at any given time, accounted for nearly 1,200 patrols over 6 years. Publisher and Army descriptions emphasized SAS squadrons as highly successful, known to the Viet Cong as Ma Rung due to their stealth and effectiveness. The statistics supported the assessment. Near invisibility combined with precision produced measurable operational impact without large force footprint or high casualties. The numbers demonstrated that in a conflict where conventional measures often failed to show progress, one metric remained clear. A small reconnaissance force could achieve disproportionate results through training, equipment, and doctrine designed for sustained operations in enemy territory. The figures also highlighted the cost of different operational approaches. Mass and firepower achieved certain objectives. Stealth and precision achieved others. The casualties reflected those different methods. Intelligence summaries from late 1970 revealed patterns in captured Viet Cong and documents and interrogation reports. Enemy orders modified movement routes and camp patterns throughout Phuoc Tuy and adjacent provinces. The changes responded to persistent Allied patrolling. Traditional guerrilla doctrine assumed government forces could not maintain constant pressure in dense jungle over extended periods. Roads and villages represented government control. Remote jungle areas provided sanctuary. This assumption shaped Viet Cong base placement, logistics, and operations. Australian operations challenged that assumption systematically. Department of Veterans Affairs and Army Analyses concluded that Australian patrolling, heavily supported by SAS reconnaissance, forced Viet Cong units to relinquish some base areas and accept greater movement risk. The evidence appeared in multiple forms. Captured orders instructed units to increase security procedures and modify camp locations. Interrogation reports described increased wariness when operating in areas previously considered secure. After-action reports from Australian operations found recently abandoned camps with signs of hasty departure. The geographic effect was measurable. Intelligence assessments from 1970 to 1971 showed reduced Viet Cong presence in core parts of Phuoc Tuy compared to 1966. Enemy forces maintained capability to conduct attacks, but their freedom of movement and access to population centers decreased. The publisher's description of SAS operations captured the mechanism. It was with good reason the Viet Cong came to call them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. The ghosting effect appeared in enemy behavior. Units moved more carefully, rested less, dispersed more widely. The psychological dimension multiplied the physical presence of patrols. With 3 to 5 SAS teams deployed at any time across hundreds of square kilometers, actual probability of contact remained low for any specific enemy unit. The uncertainty about where patrols might be located created constant vigilance requirements. This uncertainty imposed costs. Movement took longer. Security required more personnel. Rest cycles shortened. Logistics operations became more complex. The cumulative effect degraded operational capability without requiring constant combat. By early 1971, Phuoc Tuy was assessed as relatively secure compared with neighboring provinces. Local elections occurred, economic development projects proceeded. While correlation does not prove causation, the timing coincided with 5 years of intensive patrolling. The assessment occurred as Australian withdrawal planning began. The first Australian task force would hand over responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. Whether the effects of Australian operations would persist became a question for the future. Orders dated the 16th of October, 1971 directed the withdrawal of Australian forces from Nui Jat. Photographs documented the handover to South Vietnamese Army units. The 4th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment departed, ending 5 years of 1st Australian Task Force operations in Phuoc Tuy Province. The final statistics summarized Australian involvement. Peak strength reached approximately 8,000 personnel. Total Australian casualties numbered 523 killed and approximately 2,400 wounded. Enemy losses recorded by task force units totaled 3,370 killed. The SAS summary appeared in Monument Australia, Inscriptions and Department of Veterans Affairs documentation. Nearly 1,200 patrols over 6 years. Enemy casualties, 492 confirmed killed. 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, 11 captured. SIS losses: 6 deaths total, 28 wounded. Approximately 580 men served in rotating SIS squadrons. Some feared rapid Viet Cong re-infiltration would erase years of patrolling. The concern proved partially correct. After 1975, People's Army of Vietnam forces would occupy the entire province. The long-term strategic outcome of the Vietnam War was not determined in Phuoc Thuê. The operational assessment differed from the strategic outcome. Official histories judged that the 1st Australian Task Force dominated its area of operations during its tenure. The task force significantly reduced enemy ability to coerce local populations in Phuoc Thuê, while Australian forces remained present. The SAS contribution to that outcome was disproportionate to force size. 600 personnel rotating through squadrons over 6 years produced reconnaissance coverage that enabled task force operations across the province and beyond. The casualty ratio, 1 in 20 for SAS compared to 1 in 10 for U.S. forces, demonstrated the effectiveness of doctrine designed to avoid detection while maintaining operational impact. The base dismantled methodically. Lascombe airfield quieted. Artillery positions transferred to South Vietnamese forces. Supply depots cleared. The rubber plantation at Nui Jat returned to something resembling its pre-1966 state. The statistics and infrastructure could be packed and recorded. The psychological effect persisted differently. In Vietnamese memory and Australian regimental history, the presence at Nui Jat remained defined by its reconnaissance element. The 4-man patrols that operated beyond sight, the sudden contacts, the casualties inflicted from concealment. The idea of Ma Rung survived the departure from Nui Jat. In both enemy recollection and Allied documentation, the phantom designation outlasted the physical presence. David Horner's SAS Phantoms of the Jungle appeared in 1989, followed by SAS Phantoms of War, covering broader regimental history. The Phantoms of the Jungle designation appeared on dust jackets, in Department of Veterans Affairs essays, and in regimental memorials. The preservation of these operations in published form occurred against broader patterns of Vietnam War historiography. American accounts dominated post-war discourse. Australian operations received less international attention. Small unit actions disappeared entirely from many narratives. Horner's work, built on patrol reports, war diaries, and veteran interviews, preserved SAS Vietnam operations as a distinct case study. The books documented the operational method. Selection and training focused on stealth. Patrol doctrine emphasizing reconnaissance over combat. Technology employed to maximize effect while minimizing signature. The archival foundation proved essential. Patrol reports provided primary documentation. War diaries recorded daily activities. After-action reviews analyzed outcomes. Combined with participant accounts, these sources enabled reconstruction of operations decades after they occurred. The Ma Rung designation appeared throughout these materials. Official histories quoted it. Veterans confirmed it. The Vietnamese origin of the phrase, enemy terminology adopted into Australian regimental identity, illustrated the psychological dimension of operations. The quantitative record supported qualitative assessment. Nearly 1,200 patrols represented sustained reconnaissance coverage, unprecedented in scope. The casualty figures, 492 confirmed enemy killed for 6 SAS deaths, demonstrated operational effectiveness. The ratio of patrols to contacts showed doctrine working as designed. Most missions involved observation without engagement. Memorial inscriptions simplified the complex operational history into essential facts. Monument Australia records list the deployment dates, rotation of squadrons, total patrols, and casualty figures. These summaries compress 6 years into numbers that define the deployment. The enduring thesis emerged from documented performance. Power for this unit in this war was measured by invisibility. The most effective patrol was one the enemy never detected. The most successful doctrine was one that changed enemy behavior without requiring constant combat. In the official record, the Australian SAS in Vietnam are remembered less for any single battle than for a pattern. Hundreds of patrols, few casualties, an enemy nickname that distilled operational method into one phrase. The phantoms left evidence of their presence. Patrol reports, casualty statistics, captured enemy documents describing changed behavior. The ghosts proved real through their effects, documented in archives on both sides of the conflict. Ma Rung measured not by what was seen, but by what was felt.